I first came across the memoirs when I started working in German script. I was at a German script seminar in 1988 at the Bethlehem Archives, and one of the texts that was handed to us to transcribe was the Lebenslauf or memoir of Marianne Hurt, who is in the book, as you know. And that memoir struck me. It was just such an amazing document. It was, of course, a captivity narrative, an Indian captivity narrative, which is a very popular genre of American literature. I had never read anything like this. I'd never read anything written by a woman in the first person about her being captured, about an Indian raid, about her being taken up into Indian country, being forced to marry an Indian husband, having a child with that man, escaping from that marriage, coming back to Bethlehem, and then being put into the widow's choir, right? She was put into the widow's choir not because she was a widow, but because she was not a virgin. And I thought that was very interesting, that they had to think about, what are we going to do with Marianne Hurt, which choir is she going to go into? And I remember talking to Vernon Nelson about this, and he said, well, I suppose in today's society, that's where divorced women would go too, which is sort of interesting, right? Because we are women who have been married, and we have children, and therefore we do not belong in the single sisters choir. We are not in the married sisters choir. We belong in the widow's choir. So Marianne Hurt's memoir was very poignant and very powerful. And so I said to Vernon, any more like this? And he said, come with me. And took me into the vault and said, there you go, and pointed to lots and lots of boxes. And I thought, oh my Lord, this is amazing. And so I wrote my grant to the National Endowment for the Humanities, talking about how quite remarkable it was to be able to find a collection of autobiographical writings by women from the 18th century that were from women of all classes, both peasant women, artisan women, nobility, and women from different ethnic groups. You had women from Germany, you had women from Britain, you had women from North America, you had women who were Native American, you had women who were Africans. And actually, Magdalena Buehler-Brockton's memoir in this book is, I think, one of the earliest African memoir published in America. And so in a subsequent piece of scholarship, I published her memoir and her husband's, Andrew's, together with an essay on the two of them, which won a lot of prizes and has been reprinted ever since. And I'm happy to say that Henry Louis Gates, who you might know, Skip Gates, who does the Finding Your Roots program on PBS, he was very happy to find this essay, and it ends up right next to one of his in a collection, which is great. So for me, the memoir has been a fascinating project for lots of reasons. One, yes, here we have this treasure trove of autobiographical writings by people who normally would not have their autobiographies published or heard or recorded, right? And secondly, because I'm interested in the autobiographical genre, right? What is it? Why do we write autobiographies? And also, why do we read them, right? They're always on top of the bestseller lists. Why do we like looking at other people's lives? So that's really interesting to me as well. Another thing to bear in mind is that for Zinzendorf, the Lebenslauf constituted what he called the history of the invisible church. And so the way in which he conceptualized the memoir is that everybody's actions, everybody's, if you like, salvific history in the church is part of history. It builds up the church's history. You cannot write a history of the church without the history of every individual within that. And it makes sense, right? It makes sense if you think about how you are supposed to accept Christ as your Saviour, how you are supposed, especially in the 18th century, how your individual life, your most intimate life, as we saw in my last lecture, is determined by the forces of the church, the ideas of the church, living in community. And so therefore it makes a lot of sense that the memoir and the, if you like, the accretion of memoirs also constitutes the history of the church. So those are some very important things to sort of think about at the very beginning. The idea that there is this ability to, or there is this propensity of the Moravian Church to make sure that everybody's life is recorded. There is an idea of this being important not just for the individual, but for everybody. This is a public document that is read at the person's funeral. And then also that this constitutes the church in and of itself. So I don't need to show you this slide, right? So you know all of this. You are the Moravians. So I usually use this to explain to people who are not Moravian who the Moravians are. You probably know the history of behind the Lebenslauf as well. One history, and the one that I use in the introduction to my book, is that Zinzendorf, when he was in London, actually decided that the Lebenslauf would be instituted, that every individual should write one. And the point at which they write them differs, of course. He saw it, the way in which he put it was that this was your chance to say goodbye, or ade, to the church. And I find that an interesting concept too. It's a document of interiority, talking about yourself, but it is also your chance to say goodbye to everybody you've worked and lived with, not just your family, but your congregation as well. So it's a public document, so it's an inwardly directed document, and it's also an externally directed document. And one of the things that's interesting to think about is to what extent does that external directivity influence what you say about yourself? So are you going to say, I was a really happy person, and then everybody in the congregation goes, oh, what? No, miserable, right? Or the other way around, right? And so that's something else. And of course, if you're dead, right, you're dead when it's being read, so you can't say, no, you just completely misunderstood me. But it is your chance to say your piece, if you like, as you are laid to rest. So I think that is also a fascinating thing as well. So what is also, I think, what I'd say here is that this internally directed and externally directed concept of the memoir reflects also this dialectic that takes place, this movement between the individual and the congregation in everyone's lives as well. Why is it I do what I do? Is it just because of myself, or is it also because the congregation says I should do it? And of course, within the context of the 18th century, one has to think about the lot, right, as this instrument of control in some ways. It is supposedly God's will being shown through the drawing of the lot. But if you're Erdmutter von Zinzendorf and you are used to being told what to do, and you've been given this mission to go to Latvia or to St. Petersburg by your husband, who happens to be in America with Anna Nitschmann, and you can't text him, right, to ask him his advice. You can't write a letter that'll take 3-4 months to get there. Whose advice do you look for? And Erdmutter would have the lot drawn. And if she didn't like the answer, she'd draw it again. And if she didn't like the answer, she'd draw it again. And it's very interesting, right? This is the mother of the congregation, right? In 1743. And so where does volition come from? Where does the idea to shape your own life come from within this particular context? That, I think, is very interesting. And the last point here is that, of course, the 18th century is the century of confessional literature. And for those of you who are scholars of literature, you might think about the epistolary novel, right? The novel that's made of letters is one manifestation of that. The idea of a woman writing her confession within literature was taken up even by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who in his Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre has, in his Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship years, has one of the central book of that novel, that Bildungsroman, is Susanne von Klettenberg's Lebenslauf, her memoir, which is shaped like a Moravian memoir. And it's right there, dead center in the middle of Goethe's great novel. And so one of you, David, I think it was you, asked me about what are the relationships between Moravians and Goethe, and they're quite close. Some of you may know this, that Goethe's sister was a Moravian, and he visited the Moravian congregations quite often. He was fascinated by the specimen collections in Barbie at the Pedagogium there. And he also wrote about them, and as I said, so the memoir, the Moravian memoir, does have a special place within the history of German literature because it was a central part of this very famous novel. Anyway, that's all the professorial part, okay? So why is it radical? Why is the Moravian memoir radical? So the idea that everybody's experience matters is radical. Everybody's. That's a woman, that's a child, that's a teenager, that's an African slave, right? That's a Native American convert. Everybody's life matters. Kind of contemporary ring to that, right? And so this is very radical, the idea that my life matters as much as anyone's life, as the president's life, for example. And of course this has immense implications for those of us who are interested in the history of gender and the history of race. How do we look at how the self is constituted within the modern period for those who do not belong to the ruling classes, right, the white males? And how do we express concepts of agency in those documents? Agency about how to fulfill my life, how to make change in the world, how to survive in the world. Those things are very important. And these are questions that are frequently ignored by historians of autobiography. Usually they are considered to be white males who are of the upper classes who are writing their autobiographies, and not subjects like women who can talk about their lives. If women talk about their lives normally with an autobiography, they're considered to be sort of popular literature, women's literature, very much gendered along family and children, not looking at, for example, your career or your achievements. And we know that there are huge amounts of there are huge collections of memoirs in Helmholtz and in Bethlehem, and I think here too in Salem, and I'm dying to see them. And most of them haven't been published. Yes?
I have a question about the sense of the agency.
Yes.
Which is kind of what I was focusing on with the study that I did, because the sense that people have an impact on the world around them, yes, and their own lives, it just jumps off the pages.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, I see in our churches today a lack of agency, mm-hmm, almost a fatalistic sense that, well, it's just always been this way, mm-hmm, what can I do about it? What do you think, from your readings, kind of drove that sense of heightened personal sense of, I can make a difference?
Okay, so it's kind of leaping ahead a bit, but no, that's fine, that's fine. Maybe it's a good time to talk about it. So, as I said in my introduction to this part, the reason I wanted the memoirs to come now was because we discussed this idea of, we discussed the speakings. And so if every single person is considered to be important enough in their life to warrant this speaking and to have their soul and their body cared for, and it doesn't matter if you're a young boy, if you're a prepubescent boy or a girl or a married woman or a widow, your soul and your body matter. If you've had that monthly conversation all your life, I think that trains you to think of yourself as an agent of change, right? And so you get to a point when, for example, you write your memoir, where it's easy, the words come out off the page onto the page easily. Plus, you've heard these memoirs of the people you have worked and lived with as they are read at a funeral, right? So it's a tradition. You've heard other people's memoirs, and you've also been trained to think about yourself and speak about yourself, right? This idea of the discursive, I call it the discursive nature of Moravian subjectivity, which sounds ever so fancy. But it basically, to my mind, Moravian subjectivity in the 18th century is made up in the act of speaking and writing and talking about yourself in an absolutely unparalleled way in the rest of North America and in Europe, I think. I think that the pietist circles in Germany certainly have that, and they also have memoirs, but there is much more of a pattern that a pietist memoir follows, which is actually on my next slide. Well, maybe not. Okay, well, we'll get there. And I think that that's what makes, so I think if you're talking about how do we encourage agency, you have to encourage speaking, right? And vocalizing yourself, yes.
Did Zinzendorf and Erdmuth write their memoirs?
Yes, and so that's another issue too. When I'm going to show you some work I'm doing right now and talk about some of the differences, right, and some of the problems with this genre. First of all, I want to talk about what the genre is, and then talk about all of the different issues that come up with talking about memoirs. And Richard may well sympathize with me here, actually. So yes.
Question. What is literal translation of Lebenslauf?
Lebenslauf in literal translation into Latin would be curriculum vitae, and it basically means the walk of or the course of my life.
I have, it's interesting because I have grown up, and all of us actually, Moravians, grown up with the memoir at the service.
Yes.
But the Lebenslauf is my story. It is I.
Yes.
The current use of memoir for us is somebody else's story about us.
Thank you so much for saying that.
And typically, it's the pastor comes and says,
Yes.
what shall I say about
Yes.
this person at
Yes.
the funeral for you?
Yes.
And I find Lebenslauf such a deep experience.
Yes.
And it's almost like bold enough that I would write about myself something that could be shared at my funeral.
Do you want to come up here and talk? And so, no, I don't mean that. I mean that really. I mean, that is exactly it. You just encapsulated this whole moment. So, okay, so I'll throw away the structure. So, you know, the eulogy or the obituary, right, is what someone else writes about you. And the memoir, which is the English translation of the German word Lebenslauf, is supposed to be much more personal, right? Your Lebenslauf is what you write. So now, yeah, I've thrown this away, forget that. So the question you might be asking is, when do I write my memoir, right? This is a really valid question, because for women, very often women, when they are about to enter into marriage, so your single sister, right? If you read the single sister's instructions, you'll see there's a moment when she's been paired up with a single brother to get married, where she has to write her Lebenslauf. And so that's really interesting. And if you read the married women's Lebensläufe, very often they stop at the point at which she gets married. So there's a reason for that, of course. If you get married, you're going to enter into marital relations and you're going to get pregnant, and it's very likely that you could die in childbirth. Or when you get married in the Moravian Church, it means you can be sent out into the mission field and you can do work. And as we heard from the Margareta Jungmann Lebenslauf, that can be very dangerous work. You could die, and therefore you write your Lebenslauf. So this is for women, right? For men, there are different strictures on men's lives. They don't die in childbirth, but they might well die when they go out into the mission field, right? So maybe they could write their Lebenslauf then, but you'll find that I'm going to use the German word because it doesn't have the it isn't being contaminated by perhaps contemporary uses of memoir. Is that all right with you?
Yes.
Okay. So for men, they might write their Lebenslauf when they're told to. For example, in 1755, there was, as you know, the French and Indian War up in Bethlehem, and stockades had to be built. And basically, Matthias Heer said, we need to take stock of who's in our congregations. And so we're going to ask everyone to write a Lebenslauf, so we know who's in our congregations. So it could be that moment. Or it could be the moment towards the end of one's life, before you start getting too frail to write, that you write. So that's one form of the memoir. Another form is that you never had a chance to write, right? Or you wrote one of the really short one, and you came up to me and told me about Martha Bühninger. Was it you? I'm sorry. Who was it who talked about Martha Bühninger? It was you, right? Yeah, Judy. And so in my book, there's Martha Bühninger's memoir, which is very short, and it's quite sad. You know, she was an indentured slave. She was brought, well, not an indentured slave, she was an indentured servant who was brought here to work, and she talks about how miserable it was, right, how poor she was and everything. And it's a very short memoir, and it's finished by her husband. That happens a lot. Margarete Jungmanns is also finished by her husband, all right? In fact, when we get on to talk about Spangenberg's wives, Spangenberg finished his wife's Lebensläufe as well. So this happens very often, and that, I think, changes the nature of the Lebenslauf, right? You've got the woman talking about herself, and then the final comments about the woman are by her husband, and very often describe who she is from his perspective, which of course is different to the way in which you describe yourself, right? So that's an interesting tension right there. Or the Lebenslauf could be dictated to the choir helper. So that's why I wanted to do the instructions first, because you have a good idea now of the role of the choir helper. And if the sister couldn't write, then she would dictate her Lebenslauf to the choir helper. And then you see the choir helper's hand again and again and again in a lot of the memoirs. So that's not self-written, it is dictated. And then you find different versions of the memoir. You'll have the original one, then you'll have an edited one, then you might have the one that's published in the Gemeinnachrichten or later on in the Moravian Messenger. And so there are all of these different versions. And for this book, I took the original one. I said, editorial comments might take out some interesting things. And actually the Anna Pietsch-Seidel one had been heavily edited already, because she was criticizing what happened after 1760, right? And Anna Nitschmann's and Zinzendorf's deaths. I'm sorry, you had your hand up.
If a man died, wouldn't his wife help finish his Lebenslauf?
I've never seen one. It could be. I've never seen.
I'm curious about how many people in this book have written them.
Yeah, we'll get on to that. That's coming. I don't say I know everything, but I really don't. But among the memoirs that I have read, I have not found one where the wife has finished the husband's, but they could exist, yeah.
Several years ago, I had a chance to look at a translation of an infant's
Yes.
Lebenslauf,
Yes.
who had died months.
Yes. And that happens a lot. And obviously that's a Lebenslauf that's not written by the person themselves, right? Nor did they dictate it. But I think that's interesting. So that would have been probably the choir helper or the minister who wrote that.
They were talking about the positioning of the hands,
Yes.
grasping Christ, and they were putting that child
Yes.
into relationship
Yes. Yes.
with God.
Because that child's life, however brief, was part of the invisible church. So that little life mattered, right? Yes.
Just starting with the archives.
Yes.
The amazing thing to me is the intentionality with which the invisible is made visible
Yes.
by the preservation of these records.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole history in Christian theology and the experience of self-examination.
Mm-hmm.
What the dialectic that you point out is quite interesting, because it's a life reflected not just one's own experience, but as one becomes part of and grows in community.
Yes.
And then the community envelops and celebrates that life lived in community by keeping the record of that life with the totality of the spiritual experience that's expressed in those memoirs.
Wonderful. Ruth? Yeah. What time is lunch?
It's at noonish.
Right, I just looked at my watch and I realized it's 11:45. Wow. Okay, so I'm going to move, because following up from that, I don't want to. So this is, if it's all in my introduction, you don't need to read this. All right. So to follow on what you were just saying, in terms of we have preserved these documents. This is a huge topic, and actually Richard and I were just talking about it before we started this today. What do you preserve? What don't you preserve? And of course, if you're thinking about culling documents, you will cull the documents of the people you think aren't important in another archive, right? In some other archive. What do you do with a church which is based on an idea that the invisible church is made tangible through every single individual's life? And so what we have done to try to make even more tangible these lives that have not been published, because there's just like 30 in here, right? And I know this book is used in a lot of classes and Bible studies and everything, and there's just 30 in there, and they're all women. So how do we make this more available for people to see? So this is a project that I'm working on with a team of scholars at Bucknell University, at the University of Gothenburg, and probably also the University of Jena and the University of Mainz in Germany. I met the Swedish scholars in Helmhult about 3 years ago at the celebration of the archives in Helmhult, and they were very interested in the Lebenslauf, and they knew about my book, and I was presenting my work in what we call digital humanities, which is how we use computer methods to investigate questions in the humanities. And we got together and we decided that we were going to create a platform that would allow people to both find memoirs, and also, because these are mostly handwritten, transcribe them. And so this is the very ugly first page. So what we did was to create a geospatial visualization of the birth dates and death dates of all of the entries in the Helmhult and Bethlehem archive memoir collections. And so if you go to moravianlives.org, this is always dangerous doing a live presentation. All right, give me a name. Let's look up somebody. Give me a name. Someone? No? Nobody wants to give me? Etwine, thank you. So you can type the name in there. You can do a search. You can see it's visualized on the map. There are different ways in which you can visualize the occurrences of that particular person or that particular name. You have a timeline here that shows you birth dates and death dates. And then it takes you to the actual entry, the metadata entry in the memoir, all right, in the memoir register. So that's, and then you can visualize by movement as well. So you could do the same thing. You can type in, this is obviously on a very macro scale, all right. So you can look and see how Moravians moved around the world. Then we decided that we were going to try to digitize as many memoirs as we could in the archives that wanted to participate in this project. At the moment, we have records from the archives in Bethlehem, in Stockholm, in Gothenburg, from the Moravian Church there, and we have an agreement with the archive in Helmhult that their collection will also be available on this platform. And so what you can do is you can filter by language. Let's go by English. Okay. And so here you get an overview of all of the Lebensläufe that we have so far. These are the Bethlehem memoirs primarily. There are also some from Sweden. And then you can go into the transcription desk, and you can click on one of those windows. The green bars means that somebody has kindly already transcribed it. This is actually my student. This is a typewritten one. You may say, why would you bother transcribing a typewritten one? Because the transcription desk isn't just a transcription, it's also a TEI editor. So that means we're building up a gazetteer of all Moravian places and all Moravian people, which any Moravian scholar can use. And we're building it up from the transcriptions of the memoirs. Then you can go down here into this window and you have the transcription. We are still working on an export function so that when you've found the transcription, you've transcribed it, you can export it as a text file, a Word file, or as an XML file, when you can do some interesting computational analyses of these things. And obviously we're also very interested in linking the entry that is in here, in the map database, with the transcription database as well. So you can use this. If you go to moravianlives.org, you can register and you can start transcribing, which would be really nice for us. We're also actively looking for more memoirs to put on here, all right? As I said, this is a project in progress. My research assistant is in Gothenburg right now, working with the Center for Digital Humanities in Gothenburg to keep refining this desk. It has the support of the Northern Province and Paul Poiker, of Claudia Mai in Helmut as well, and of the archivists in Sweden. So you can play with this yourselves. You don't need me to.
So, is it current still?
Yes.
So
yes. So if I could talk about some of the issues, right, with this goes up to, up here it says 2012. And so Claudia Mai raised her hand, and actually I've completely thrown the structure of my talk out now. So Claudia Mai was concerned, what about people we know, right? And their memoir is up here. Do they want it to be on this platform? And so we talked about, Claudia suggested a 12-year waiting period. And so we have waited, right? We haven't put in the most modern ones. What we've done is we've started with the oldest ones, so the manuscripts, and we've developed what was known as an OCR, an optical character recognition program for German Fraktur. And not just German Fraktur, this is Moravian Fraktur, because the Moravian publications had their own very, very special font that they used. And so my research assistant has created this program that will scan the pages and then enter them in with 99.9% accuracy. So this makes all of those things that are published in the Gemeinnachrichten, once it's gone into print in the 19th century, we can now make those accessible through this platform as well, through the database. So this is a really long answer to your question, right? Which is, the premise of this platform is not just to let's expose everyone's lives, right? The premise behind this digital humanities platform is we are doing what we think Zinzendorf said we should do, which is to continue to recognize that everybody's life makes up the invisible church, which has also been made tangible, even if it's in digital form, right? Even if it's in virtual form. So I think I'm going to throw out my structure completely, and I'm going to just stop talking there. I haven't covered a fraction of what I was going to talk about in this lecture, but you guys took over, and that's totally fine. So then I'll just finish up here. This is what I'm going to talk about later on. I talked about the motivation for the Memoirs book being let's show the history of women, what women have done, right? All kinds of different women. And my next book project is looking at women we think we know, like Anna Nitschmann, and Spangenberg's wives, Eva Spangenberg, Martha Spangenberg. We know Anna Seidel from her memoir, but do we really know what's going on? So what I'm working on is a new biography of the leading women in the Moravian Church. And that's what I was working on in the spring at the archives in Bethlehem. I've discovered a lot of really interesting stuff about Anna Nitschmann, I'll talk about later on. And I've also been working in Herrnhut as well, and what can be found in the archives still, because as you know, things were culled in 1760. Her diaries and her letters were all destroyed. And I'm also really interested in looking at the relationship between Anna Nitschmann and Erdmutter von Zinzendorf. Was it really, as Janusz said, eine Ehe zu dritt, right? A threesome marriage. So anyway, so this is going to be, this is my next project, okay? And these are just some of the questions that I think we're going to be discussing later on this afternoon, which maybe in some ways you've already started thinking about or even started doing. So we'll be working on these later on.